You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week for our holiday break, we're going back in time to episode 108, which we recorded in Cambridge, England with Daniel Garcia and Luca Aiello of Bell Labs. We chatted about using social media to map sensory experiences in cities, including smells and soundscapes. Stay with us. Hey everybody, as you can hear in my voice, I've got a bit of congestion, but that and Christmas falling on Wednesday just meant that we had to put out the show a few days later. Before the new year, I again just want to thank everybody for listening. It really means so much. And for more information about how to find us and our work, check out the show notes or visit theoverheadwire.com. Happy holidays. So a bit of a funny backstory for this episode. I took the train with Daniela to Cambridge and got to see their lab, but I forgot my voltage converter for my soundboard, so I fried it. And I turned it on, and I smelled a little bit of smoke and a spark, and it was done. So no microphones for this one. Hence, we had to record on my laptop speakers, but you know what? It turned out okay. It was in the middle of the table, and it got everybody's voices, so I was happy about that. It doesn't sound too bad, but some kind of fun background to start this show.
Daniele Quercia and Luca Aiello, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. Welcome.
What do you guys do here at Bell Labs?
We do research the team is about social dynamics, and the idea is that to analyze data to answer questions typical of the social sciences, like political science or urban science, and so that's why it's computational social science, the area. So you try to answer social science question in a computational way with data and computational methods. That's what we do basically.
So you guys use data, and it's really amazing stuff. Why is data so important to cities?
Data is important to cities because if you look at the planning process, right, the traditional planning process is you sort of had the theories, then you apply it to theories to some planning decisions, right, and then you observe the outcomes. Now, all of a sudden with these sensor actuators and technologies and they produce data, the flow between these blocks, like you have two theories, then you do something in planning, then you look at the results, that kind of flow is really faster. Right? So the communication cost between these blocks is lower. So data allows you to actually see what happens, I wouldn't say in real time, but a far finer grain level than it was possible before.
And how do you guys collect data? I mean, what kind of data sources are you using?
So we're using many sources from social media data. In the past we've used Flickr data, Instagram data, also Twitter sometimes. This data is great because you can have a public API accessible, so you can crawl the data from the web in a free form, so it's free to access, and all this data is geolocated, so most of it is geolocated, so you have, for instance, geographic coordinates attached to a picture, and you have also metadata that describe that geolocation. And so for many of the studies we've done, we relied on this metadata attached to the photos or to any geo-reference content to describe a part of the city, a street or a neighborhood, and so on.
Cool. And what are some of the most interesting things you guys have come across while you're mining data?
Oh, there are so many interesting things. So if you wanted to summarize the research with the title, it would be sort of sensory mapping. So the idea is that you stand on a street and you perceive that street in a certain way. Now, the way you perceive it is dependent on your feelings, on how you perceive the street. And we know our senses, right? You can look at the street. So you perceive it as beautiful, as ordered, right? As street that makes you happy, right? When you look at it. So visually. Then you can perceive through your nose. And then you can perceive through your ears what you hear. So the whole research we're trying to do is how can we capture the sensory perception at the entire city scale. So that's all the projects, how you would describe under this umbrella, right? Of sensory mapping.
I noticed that you guys have focused on smell and then also sight and happiness. And then there's another one too, noise.
Yes, it's actually sound,
yes.
Right? Because the key, maybe Luca can tell more, but the key there is that a lot of research has translated sound in a city and has equated sound to noise. In reality, there are all sorts of things that people like in terms of sound, like church bells or like people on the street, children, these kind of things. They actually equate to something positive, and those things are being totally overlooked.
No, indeed. So one of the reasons why people have looked into noise quite much is because noise really is correlated with health issues that people living in cities, right? So people living in very noisy environment are more likely to get illnesses given by noise. But of course, also the positive aspect of sound can have a positive impact on health as well. So that aspect has been disregarded. So it's very important because of health, but for both sides, for positive and negative sounds.
And what are the 4 types of sounds that are found in cities?
We found maybe more than 4
Maybe
categories.
more than 4,
Yeah,
yeah,
so
10.
it's I think it's
10 or 12.
6.
Oh, 6.
6
Okay.
main categories. So we found 10 for smell and 6 for sound. So if I remember correctly, for sound, the main ones, we have nature-related sounds, sounds from traffic, engines, and street vehicles on the streets. Some sounds related to people. So people walking, talking. What else?
Music, I think. Was
Music, of course.
Yeah.
Sound of music, and a couple more, which
Yes.
I can't recall now.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Basically, when you go on goodcitylife.org and you look under Chatty Maps, is the project, and then you will see the 4 main sound categories, right? So we identify 6, and you can look in the scientific papers which one, but the main ones we're mapping there 4. That's why in the map you find 4, but in reality we find more.
And why did you guys find that the negative sounds were what people were focusing on instead of the positive ones?
Traffic mainly. Decibel level was the measure of noise in the city, of sound in the city. We know that decibel is not really something that is a good proxy for sound, right? It's a good proxy maybe for noise levels. But sometimes when it's also context dependent. When you are in a concert, you don't want to have low decibel level, right? So different activities might require different types of sounds, right? So mapping the music sounds is far more promising than mapping the decibel level, for example. And that's what you can do through social media.
And is there some sort of application where you can use this data that you're finding out, something that cities would be appreciative of?
There are applications in planning, right? So all of a sudden now you have a language that you can give to, for example, planners to actually see how, on average, different parts of the city would sound, right? And then they can do intervention, and then they can say, okay, after a year, the soundscape changed in this way, right? So all of a sudden you have something that can measure with numbers the impact of even small interventions inside the city.
What's the feedback that you guys have gotten from this research that you've been doing?
So initially, back in the days when we started with our Happy Maps project, we started to ask people some feedback about the output of our algorithms. For instance, we were recommending alternatives routes from point A to point B that were not just minimizing the time, so the walking time, but also maximizing the experience in terms of beauty of the surroundings or quietness and so on. So we started with this small user study. Back in the days, it was overall 50 people between Boston and London. So we got feedback from this initial circle of people. And then we started to build a larger community under this website, goodcitylife.org. And basically, as of now, we have many people who join the community. And so we have almost 700 people who join the community. Most of them want to actively contribute because they have experience in their local community and they want to make some impact in the local community, or they have some expertise in urban planning, or they're passionate about technology in relation to city. And so slowly we're trying to build up this community and collecting feedback from these people that actually work in the area. So it's I think it's pretty lively.
Do you find that people are surprised when you show them the maps of where the good routes are, the happy routes are, in those maps that you've made?
Everything is obvious once you know the answer. So after you show them, it's very difficult to post-rationalize why is a happier street, right? Because they would say, oh, yeah, that street has got a lot of greenery, it's a small one, and there are even sometimes children that play on the street. That's a sort of proxy for safety, right? So, yeah, after you show that, they're not that surprised. But what they're really surprised about is like the extra walking time that you add is minimal. So the application works in a way that it will find all shortest paths, and it will give you the short path that is more pleasant, that is happier. And sometimes it translates into, instead of having a walk of 22 minutes, it's a walk of 20 minutes. Instead of a walk because you're taking a parallel. Instead of a walk of 10, you're having a walk of 9. And when you show that to people, they say, wow, okay, so you're not impacting my walking time, you're changing my experience. Why on earth companies are not doing that, right? So that's a typical reaction that we got from the project.
And how much does urban design play into this as well? You have the smells, you have the sound, but then what about the urban design? Because we know that urban design impacts how we feel as well, especially when we're walking down the street.
Yes. I mean, a lot of urban design does impact the sensory perceptions, right? So impacts the soundscape, impact the smellscapes, impact the way we perceive visually streets. But if you compare urban design versus technologies, they work in a totally different time scales, right? So the urban design is in a time scale maybe of 5 years, if you're lucky, or 10 years, and you can't change it very much. You can't change the street layout from one day to the other. Whereas technology is actually a way of changing daily habits of people in a sort of even dramatic way in a year time for the good, right? So they are actually working on totally different time scales. And then in urbanism, you can also think about tactical urbanism, right? So tactical urbanism is like when you basically do small-scale intervention, low-cost intervention, it might have a big impact. Now, has anyone thought about how can you basically measure the outcome of this tactical urbanism that is emerging in US especially? And the sensory mapping might be one way of saying, okay, when you painted this of green, this side of the street, that was the outcome, the change, right? The sensory scape of the city.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about it that way, thinking about urban spaces are there and the street network is there, but you can always change the sounds and the smells and the feeling that you get from that place.
Totally. So you think you can decide, can take a street and you can say, I decide to put public benches, right? Reasonable. Mostly, people don't think, once they put public benches, they don't think about what kind of sensory perception you're creating around the public benches. What kind of sound do you want? Can you modify the sound? Well, possibly, right? So depending on the gradient of privacy that in the position of the street you have, you can decide to place the public bench there or not. Are you putting a lavender thing next to the public benches? Maybe it's a good idea because lavender is relaxing. Mint is energizing, and maybe you don't want to put it next to a public bench. So all these considerations are not made right now, but now if you have a technology that can measure these kind of sensory perceptions and the smell, for example, in this case, then you can plan for it because you have a language, right, to describe it, and now you can plan it.
And you mentioned smell. What are some of the smelling languages?
You mean the smell categories?
Yeah.
So the smell categories were, I think, we're 10, right?
Oh yeah, we're again 10 categories, and again, so you have
Nature,
the smell
traffic.
smell of traffic, smell of nature, smell of trash and garbage, smell of smoke, industrial smells, synthetic smells, all these sort of things. So it's very sort of
Then on the
complex
positive side, in addition to nature, you have also food and
Indeed,
people.
yeah, indeed.
The weird one was animals.
Animal smell?
Yeah, because you have an entire category of animal smell, right? And when you look at it, it's dogs and things. But then when you map it, you have, of course, the public gardens are gonna have animal smell, right? But the really hot spot, and it's obvious once you know the answer, is the zoo. Right, so you can clearly see the zoo emerging as a sort of smell of animals.
I know that near my grandmother's house, it's always skunks. You can always smell when they've sprayed somebody. It doesn't matter if you're 5 miles away or what, but there's always a skunk smell somewhere, maybe on a warm night. That's really interesting. So all these smells are in a smell dictionary. Is that correct?
Yes. So we built one of our contribution was to build the smell dictionary through smell walks. So we would go around and we would ask people, which smell do we have, and then over the years we built this lexicon, right, of smell-related words, and then we match the lexicon with picture tags that are geo-referenced in the city, right, and then all of a sudden, out of 1 billion tags, even if you have 10% or 5% of these tags related to smell, you can clearly map the smellscape of the city.
And you guys map all these things. When you're trying to use colors to map the specific smells and stuff, is it hard to kind of match them up? So, purple, that's usually a good color, and then the smell might be,
Yes.
what's the smell that's related to that, right?
We actually wrote a paper on the chromatic layers of smell.
The chromatic layers of smell.
Yeah.
When you smell something, like what you feel like you see, or how does that?
Yes, I mean, the goal was to answer that question. So the idea was, because on social media, right, so you have pictures, picture tags. And from pictures, you can extract colors. Now, all of a sudden, in a quantitative way, you can see statistical association between if I have a lot of nature smell, what's the predominant color? And there, of course, is like green and a bit of brown.
Yeah.
Right? Then when I have like traffic smell, well, the predominant thing is like gray and black with a bit of red. So now all of a sudden you can associate statistically, when you have a certain smell, what kind of colors tend to be predominant. So we know that certain categories like nature and traffic, they have predominant smells. Other categories like food, for example, they have a sort of set of different kind of colors. There is no one definitive color that would represent that kind of category.
Do these smells and also the sounds, is there a way to relate them to memory as well?
That's a super interesting question.
Indeed. So this is something that we were planning for some time to do in the future. So one of the first feedback we received as well when we did this user study for the Happy Maps project was indeed about memories, right? So a reason why a person might choose a drive from going from A to B is because of several reasons. Smell and sound can be some, right? But sometimes also smell and sounds can trigger some memory. Right? Some personal memory, for instance, or even some collective memory. So streets can store collective memory. So when there was a historical building in that spot and maybe is not there anymore, so people really, when explore and experience the city, think about memories that they connect with that spot in the town, the place in the city. So either collective or personal memories. So it's something that we plan to do in the future, to try to measure the collective experience of memories in the city, but it's kind of challenging, so it's not maybe as straightforward as for senses, right? So, but we'll do that in the future.
Do you guys personally have anything where you have a smell or a sound that triggers a memory, like very specifically?
Specifically for me, I mean, my grandparents' home, right? So when I go there, I mean, it immediately triggers memories of my childhood, of some certain cakes and certain biscuits that I enter. Is like, wow, okay, that's what I remember.
Yeah. So it happened to me like 2 days ago. So I entered a shoe shop, and some of the shoes were made of plastic, right? And it was the same plastic that it was used for some toys, which I was playing when I was a kid, right? So
Yeah.
they're exactly the same plastic, and the smell was the same, and I immediately related the smell to my past experience. So it's really immediate. You maybe don't realize it from time to time, but it's really tightly connected, the experience of the smell and the memory.
Do you think cities in the future could use that to kind of trigger memories or feelings in people, kind of to control their senses almost, to control how they feel about a place?
Cities might, but to a certain extent, if you think about it, it's what Walt Disney does in the theme park, right? So he's constructing the average ideal town city in the US, right? Sense that has got a center town and then a small. So they're doing that because they're storytellers, right? So they're sending a story. Big cities, maybe they currently do it really well at the large scale. So in the sense that if you think about Barcelona, for example, I love this city, it's my favorite city. But if you think about the interventions that they do, a few interventions are really tailored to big things that are memorable. And once things become memorable, a certain building and a certain location, then people get attracted to it, right? So you have more tourists and things. So they are selling these kind of things that remind you something, and then you have to go there to actually experience it, right? So it's a sort of a window shop thing. But definitely there could be some ways of basically, the only question there is that you need sort of really good data that allows you to understand how do you trigger certain memories to people. And to a certain sense, there are projects where they're doing brain scanning, right, of people going around in London, but also in Boston, going around and you scan their brains while they walk. Mm-hmm. And now you can see the different activities, arousals and things. Then you might have technologies might be able to allow you to record what you remember on the way. right? On your phone, you can record with hashtags, whatever, right? And then we would have a way of saying, okay, here usually people remember this thing because it's related to this structural feature in the city. And once you can compile that, then you can kind of see how cities could be using that. But we are not there yet, unfortunately. I'm not sure.
It seems like it could be good and bad because
Yes.
some people have certain reactions to some things that other people don't necessarily. So somebody who thinks bubblegum smells good, another person thinks bubblegum smells bad.
So when we did the work of Happy Maps, it was based on the visual things of a game and the web game where you show pictures and you say which one is more beautiful, right? And people would say, oh, but beauty is subjective. But the point of the project was to show that it's subjective for certain things, but other things, there is consensus emerges, right? So if you have greenery, there is a consensus that's beautiful in a way, right? So if there's more spatial greenery. If you have a fast-moving car, this is consensus that is not really a sort of a street you want to be into. And the same thing for anything, right? So if you know that if you're walking on a street pavement and next to you there is an anonymous wall that is just a wall, a black wall, without any window, without anything, then the perception is going to be totally different. And if you were to walk on the same wall, but where there would be like little shops and windows and things. So we already know some associations that people make universally, right, to things, right? A wall, anonymous wall versus a wall full of windows and shops. So we are starting to actually map those.
We had some folks on the podcast recently who talked about, they basically mapped out furniture and street furniture and fenestration, so the windows and how many windows there were, and you could tell what places, and then you could predict how much people walked in those places, which is really interesting from that perspective. And it seems like you're saying kind of the same thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, it's like maybe it's a 5 minutes walk on the street, but the structural features you have in the street is totally different. And nowadays, if you think about it, Google Maps doesn't take into account 5 minutes is equal to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But the experience could be dramatically different for people.
And also, I noticed that you mentioned there's a connection between the smell and possibly public health. Where did that come from?
It comes from the fact, think about the simple case of a runner in the city, right? So we run in the city, if we're in the city, if we want to keep healthy. And so if you look at your blood pressure, so your blood pressure, if you run, goes really up, right? Dramatically up. In parallel, your ability to absorb air pollutants goes exponentially high with your blood pressure. So that means that if your blood pressure goes up, your ability to be a sponge of nitrogen oxide is far higher. Now, if you combine the two things, when you run, you're a sponge for nitrogen oxide. That means that you're doing an activity that is doing more harm than good. And then I wouldn't advocate not to run. I would say, okay, you run, but by avoiding a big traffic street, as people do. But now, if you think about that, if you're able to map the entire smellscape of the city, you can actually optimize automatically the running paths of people. So you can actually minimize the exposure to nitrogen oxide, and not only, you can even maximize the exposure to things that are conducive to the activity of running, which is smells that are energizing, like, for example, in the case of meat. Right? So now all of a sudden you have an automatic way, an application for runners that they're going to live a couple of years more in their lives, right? Just by using that.
What's the urban opticon?
Oh, the urban opticon gets into the idea of what you recognize. So why is important what you recognize in a city visually? Right? And so the idea was that we would replicate Milgram experiments that was done in 72, but on the web. So Milgram, what he did, he showed to his students in New York different parts of New York for 90 minutes, and he asked them to guess where each picture was taken. Then he collected all the responses, and after a month he hand drew them up on New York. And he could see that Manhattan was more visible than Queens and Brooklyn. Now the assumption there in urban planning is that things that are more visible, they tend to enjoy, so areas are more visible in the mental maps, in the mental models of people, they tend to enjoy better socioeconomic conditions. That was the assumption in Milgram time, and Milgram to a certain extent showed that. The Urban Opticon project was about what if we make that experiments 90 minutes into a 1 minute gaming with a purpose, where I show Google Street View, you have to guess where the Google Street View were taken, and then you can build automatically the map of recognizability. And then we could test for the first time, we had data to say, okay, is there a relationship between recognizability and socioeconomic conditions? And actually there is a strict relationship between the two. So areas that tend to be in the mental maps of Londoners, for example, they tend to enjoy far better socioeconomic conditions than other areas.
And how is that? You guys used tube data to figure out kind of where people were going from certain socioeconomic areas to others.
Yes. The interesting stuff, connected to the Urban Opticon project was Urban Opticon can tell you the recognizability map of the city, right, of London, which parts are recognized. Then the tube data can tell you, since it's widely used, the tube in London, the subway, then they can tell you where people actually go. Now, all of a sudden, you have another concept that was introduced by Milgram that was distinctiveness. And the idea is that there might be areas of the city where the people recognize Big Ben, but they don't go every day, right? So now if you scan recognizability by the tube data, you say there are areas that people recognize, but they don't go as much as you would expect from the London Underground data. Yes, there are. And you can identify actually iconic buildings and architecture in the city, right? Things that are stick in people's mind, even if they're not exposed every day. So that's one use of it that we did of the London Underground data. The other use is you can actually take the data and see how people move in the city. So you know where they live, you know where they go, and you can all of a sudden see that what we found is that people from deprived neighborhoods, they go to other deprived neighborhoods and well-to-do neighborhoods. Whereas people from well-to-do neighborhoods, they go only to other well-to-do neighborhoods. Now, all of a sudden, there is the consequence there, that is, well-to-do neighborhoods, they enjoy any flow of people. So they're exposed to everyone, so they get into people's mind. Whereas deprived neighborhoods, they're exposed only to generally other deprived neighborhoods, so they stick in certain people's minds, right? Mm-hmm. And that goes with the concept of recognizability and socioeconomic conditions.
I was also wondering about like digital data that you guys use from social media. Is it focused on specific neighborhoods more than others? So socioeconomically disadvantaged areas aren't going to be taking as many Flickr photos or data like that. So how would you account for that?
No, sure. The coverage is a problem, right? So in a city, you have central areas that are usually more covered. People take more Flickr or Instagram pictures in the city center rather than in the neighborhoods, right? Still, the volume, it's high enough most of the times to have a pretty accurate profile at street level of that street. So in our research, we've done some work that actually tries to answer this question. So how many pictures do you need to have an accurate smell profile, sound profile for that street? And it turns out that, with maybe 10 to 30 photos, you can get a reasonable description of what's going on there. Of course, you don't have coverage everywhere, right? So there are cities that are less covered than others. So you might think about also some mechanism for engagement. So for people maybe go in there and take in georeference annotations, or look at different orthogonal data sources online that can complement each other, of course. But in general, for big cities, so capitals around the world, the coverage is very good, and the mapping can be very high quality.
So what got you guys interested in cities? I mean, you're data scientists. What got you into thinking about cities in a more holistic way?
Personally, I did my PhD in computer science, was applied data mining, and then I moved into cities because I did my postdoc at MIT, the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies, and now I'm basically mixing the two. So I'm combining data mining in the context of cities, and that what got me into cities related stuff.
Yeah, so I started working with Daniele back in the days when we both were working at Yahoo. So he basically brought this perspective on cities to the research team, and we tried to complement this point of view with complementary skills like network science, social media analysis, and so on. And in the end, if you think about it, it's really nice because even for a person like me who's interested in social interactions, so how people connect, create groups, create social links, cities are really the environments in which people meet, get along together and have most part of the social lives, right? So I think it's a pretty tight connection in there.
And what's the future of your guys' work? Do you have anything coming down the pipe that might be fascinating to folks?
Yeah, a few things
that you can talk about.
that we can talk about. Maybe we leave the applications on one side that are immediate. But one thing that fascinates us is the questions that are left. So if you think about, we are mapping the sensory perception of people. We have work on visual, we have work on smell, on sound. Now the missing bit is touch and memories. So those are the two things that are actually the hardest bits, because we don't know exactly how to do them. We have a few ideas about touch, a few ideas about memories, but we haven't really figured out how touch and memories would play, even if we were able to capture them, how they would be part of technologies that would assist people's daily habits, right? You can assist, things that are once in a while and so on, artistic projects, but if you have to think about technologies on a daily basis, then it's very difficult to understand in which ways memories and touch might be useful systematically.
I'm trying to think of like how memory would be tied in, but I was just thinking about, cities that have bad reputations and how a memory of that place might keep people away from coming back. It might be hard. There was recently an article, and I think it was in National Geographic, but I'm not sure, about Juarez, Mexico, and how they've changed their culture over the last 10, 15 years from being a really bad drug city to people standing up and saying, no, this is my city. I don't want this happening here. And so thinking about how you change a city and then the memory of that city of what it was and how that keeps people from coming back to a place that's gotten better. Or even Cali in Colombia or places like that. But anyways, just thinking about how the memories of that place might affect their ability to come back home, or if they left because of bad stuff happening. There's also good stuff. We always think about the bad stuff, but there's also the good stuff as well, obviously, as you guys mentioned.
Yeah, so if you had a way of, say, sort of automatic parsing of language, they would say, oh, this is about a memory, this is not about memory. Now all of a sudden think about Airbnb, the traces you leave on Airbnb. It is about your experience. And maybe out of all these experiences, 10% is about memories that the city left you. And you could actually mine those digital traces to actually compile, right, a collective memory that people might have of that city. And you can see then over time how that collective memory changed, right? So in the case of Mexico, maybe you're going to see the experiences that people live like tourists, it change over the years and so on. But from the computer science perspective, the point is that you don't have this magic tool that allows you to say, oh, this is about a memory, and then you can classify as a memory and you can extract it out of that data, right?
Is there any magic data that you wish you had?
Definitely the magic data is what is called ground truth gold standard, which is like saying I want to have the pure, most objective data possible about the way you feel when you stand on a street at any given point in time. That means if I can read your mind, and brain scanning is getting to that, but it's very far. If I read your mind at any point in time and I read all the minds of people, then I know how they feel. And that's basically the objective representation of how you feel right now or how we feel standing on a street. And if we had that data, then we do all sorts of ways, right? So we could quantify how the structure of the environment is impacting what people feel, how the different technology use of the mobile phones can impact on what people feel, all sorts of things that we could measure if we had that data, which I don't think we will ever have, right?
You don't think people will be putting big old helmets on their head that have sensors in them and walking around and seeing how they experience things?
Yeah, they do that already in projects by brain scanning. And you can see these technologies that will become smaller and smaller, so that we will have that. But philosophically speaking, some people question the fact that that's an objective representation of what you feel. It's just a sort of a brain scanning, reading, and then transforming that in high-level features like arousal, excitement. Nobody knows that actually this translation of high-level feature is correct. And actually, Luca.
Yes, so just recently in this field of brain scanning and mapping the signal of the brain into higher level signals, there has been quite some debate in the community about a bug in the software that parses all this data from the brain scanners. And a very influential person who works in this field recently told that very likely a huge amount of papers published in that field, almost 40,000 papers in the field, are probably flawed because of this bug. So all the work that has been done in the past using standard fMRI equipment has probably to be revised in a sense. So a lot of technological challenges as well.
Do you know what the bug was?
So it was a bug in the software that parses the signal. And basically, so I'm not expert in the area, but the point is that the software made some sort of assumption about the distribution of the signal that wasn't correct. So it was basically a programming issue in the software that translates the signal to higher level signals. And that's an issue, right? Because how long does it take before you actually realize about this sort of problem? It's really complex. So still a long way to go in that area, I think. Yeah.
The two cities you guys focus on mostly are London and Barcelona. Are there any other cities that you'd like to look at all of this information for?
Yeah, if you go on goodcitylife.org, you're going to have the maps of more than 11 cities around the world, including in US.
Another thing that just popped in my head is you guys focus a lot on people's reactions to cities as they're walking or biking or outside of the bubble that is a car. What do you guys think about how that relates? I mean, because if you're behind the wheel of a car and you're inside your own kind of climate-controlled area, that keeps you away from experiencing the city as you guys are researching.
A lot, right? So I've been asked actually by a few car makers company what we think about cars and how to make them happy, like in contrast to happy maps, happy walks, how you can do happy cars. And I struggle with that because, I mean, that's my personal opinion. I don't think cars are going to be the future. It's like if you think about horses, right? So horses back in the days were used for transport of goods and people. Now they are used, especially in England, around Cambridge, they're used for sort of well-off people that want to have the leisure time in the weekends. Now, if you think about it, cars are going to be the same, right? So cars are going to be used for transportation of goods and people right now. In the future, they might be likely to be part of the leisure experience. So you're going to have really good cars, sport cars that are going to be sold over and over again, and people are going to use in the weekends to have that experience to drive the Porsche, right? And the feeling that you have to drive the Porsche is very different than driving possibly a Volkswagen, right? So I think I can see the shift. And then for daily stuff, then you're going to have a more integrated transportation system, right? Where you have multimodal transportation, where you can use for certain part of the journey, you can use the bike, and then you can pop into the subway station and get the subway station on the bus and so on. And we're going to have more technology that are going to make that kind of transition really smooth, right? So you can have a sort of Google Now that will tell you every second what's the transition you need to make that will minimize your discomfort but optimize your travel time, for example, right? So that's not very difficult to imagine.
So where can we find you guys on social media?
Social media, we have our own social media Twitter accounts. We have actually on Medium, we open a new publication that is called Social Dynamics, where we basically blogs on events we go and we blog about academic stuff. And then, I mean, on goodcitylife.org, of course, you're going to find a newsletter and you can subscribe to the newsletter, but or you can subscribe to the community. And there, we are actually thinking about how we could possibly engage these people. So, Luca said we have 700 people. How can we design activities for these people to actually come together? And social media might be part of it. But definitely a website, goodcitylife.org, plus our Twitter account might be a good source of inspiration for people.
Cool. Maybe. Well, Daniele and Luca, thank you for joining us. We really, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting TheOverheadWire.com or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect.
Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.